What occurred that time you witnessed the fury of a patient man? My grandfather is a nice, funny, flirty guy. Was an exec in a manufacturing business after being the third employee. Everyone gets along with him, and he was fairly well off in my small town. One day my cousin and I are helping him with some work, and we go to the store. There had a lot of poverty in my hometown, and one of the poorer families was at the store. My cousin makes some comment, he was kind of shit at this point, about them being poor and what were they doing at the store because they couldn't buy anything or something along those lines. My nice grandfather grabs him and slams him against a wall and says, "Nothing in your life makes you better than them. Right now, I'd rather have them by me than you." He then makes my cousin go apologize, and my grandfather announces my cousin will pay for whatever they're getting. He makes my cousin work off the expenses for him to prove a lesson, and now that cousin is a stand-up social worker specializing in poverty, abuse, and rehabilitation. Only time I have ever seen my grandfather be aggressive.
That's a pretty intense moment. Your grandfather clearly had strong values about treating people equally. It's interesting how a single incident can change someone's path, like your cousin becoming a social worker. Shows that sometimes tough love is necessary for growth. It's nice to see how a lesson can turn into something positive in the long run. That really sticks with you. It's a reminder of the impact our actions have on others.
Working in an auto parts warehouse, one of our managers was a very quiet, collected person. One particular day, some of the orders were wrong, and the ordering system was malfunctioning. He calmly goes out back, starts up a forklift, and rams at full speed at a huge stack of wood pallets. He must have thrown it in reverse and repeated this about a dozen times, raising and lowering the forks appropriately. Everyone stopped working to watch as every last pallet was destroyed. When there was only a pile of wood scraps left, he turned off the lift and calmly walked back in and continued working as if nothing happened.
That's an interesting story. It's wild how some people handle stress. I guess he just snapped and took it out on the pallets instead of people. The way he went back to work like it was nothing shows a weird kind of calmness. It's one of those moments where you think about how people react under pressure. Not something you see every day in a warehouse.
Gym class in high school. The quiet, nerdy kid kept getting picked on during dodgeball. One jerk kept hitting him with balls, even when he was already out. The quiet kid wasn't tiny. He was about average size, maybe a little taller than average. He eventually lost his temper, ran across the court, and literally delivered a double-handed choke slam to the jerk. Being a bunch of teenage boys, we all lost our shit cheering for him. He got suspended for 3 days, but it was reduced to 1 day in school after a bunch of us went to principal and explained the circumstances.
That gym class moment was something else. The quiet kid finally snapped, and it was like a scene from a movie. Everyone backed him up afterwards, which was kind of cool to see. I mean, we all knew he was just fed up. The suspension was a bit harsh, but at least he didn't get kicked out completely. It definitely changed how we all viewed him after that.
My grandfather was a man who rarely talked and never rushed. He once had a completely silent argument with my so. They slammed the back door at each other until they broke the window in it. That said, he was a steel worker for a moving company on the weekends. He was short but built like a brick house. When I was very young, I don't remember what led up to it, but I remember my father making my grandmother cry. Then I remember my grandfather charging him like a bull, grabbing my father and pitching him across the house. My dad made the good decision and bolted as soon as he got up. That was the one and only time I saw my grandpap lose his temper.
That's an interesting story. Your grandfather sounds like a tough guy who rarely showed his emotions. It's wild to hear about him getting angry like that, especially since he usually kept things quiet. The whole silent argument thing is kind of funny in a way. I guess it shows how strong family dynamics can be. It's pretty memorable that your dad knew to back off.
worked at a retail store. My manager was a very kind and soft-spoken man, about 5 feet 5 inches and not scrawny, but not built. I never saw him lose his temper, except once. A guy in another department was stocking shelves, Bill, and he is in a wheelchair. A huge, gnarly-looking guy comes up and starts arguing with Bill about whether or not they have this or that, and the guy loses his temper, tries to pull Bill out of his chair to beat him up. I was further down the aisle, but I started towards them because fuck no, you don't mess with Bill. Out of absolutely nowhere comes my manager. I mean, he flew out of thin air and tackled this huge jagoff to the ground, and after some fisticuffs, the asshole gave up, and my manager literally sat on his head until the police arrived some 15 or so minutes later.
That's quite a scene. It's surprising to see a gentle manager turn like that. You usually think of retail as pretty calm and mundane. But when someone crosses a line, it can bring out a really protective side in people. It must have been intense watching that unfold. Not every day you see someone stand up like that, especially for a coworker. It's good to know some folks really have your back.
My FIL is such a patient man. He's quiet, reserved, has a great sense of humor, while my MIL lets him get any words in. My MIL talks. A lot. She will ask you questions, and when you start to answer, she talks over you and tries to answer them herself. It's infuriating and obnoxious. One time she asked me a question, and I started to answer her. She cut me off to basically finish my answer for me, and starts to ask another question. Lather, rinse, repeat for about 4 questions. Finally, my patient, quiet, sits back and watches the world FIL just explodes on her, basically screaming at her. Mill, oh my God, let her actually answer the question you asked. Stop interrupting. You never let anyone finish their thought. It was glorious, and I almost tackled him to hug him. She still does it, but that day was amazing.
That sounds like a tough family dynamic. Your FIL finally had enough. And it's interesting how a usually quiet person can reach a breaking point. Seeing someone stand up like that can be pretty shocking, especially in a situation like yours. It's great that he spoke up for you. Sometimes you need that kind of support to let you feel heard. It's a situation that probably sticks with you.
My dad was career Army as an officer. I have always known him as a soft-spoken, kind, never gets angry kind of person. He rarely ever raises his voice that I know of. There's a law in the U.S. that basically protects any service member nearing 20 years from being forced out so they can get full retirement benefits. One day, he gets a call from his commanding general telling him that he is going to be forced put due to budget cuts Army-wide. He got up out of his seat and started yelling at the general on the phone that it was impossible due to the law since he was in the safe zone. He started quoting section after section, yelling at the general, telling him he had fucked up and that it better be fixed. A few days later, my dad got a call again from the general, and the first thing the general said was, "Before you say anything, let me apologize for the other day. You were 100% correct. But budget cuts are budget cuts." And as soon as my dad hit 20 years, he was retired.
It's interesting to see a softer person like your dad switch gears like that. You wouldn't expect it from someone who's usually calm. It must have been intense for him to feel so passionately about the situation. And it's good the general acknowledged his mistake. At least your dad got to retire after that, even if the process was a bit rough. It shows there's more to people than what they portray daily.
I laughed. My dad has the patience of a saint. You never see him get angry or pissed off. He's quiet, calm, and so laid back. Pretty much like me. Even when we were kids, he never gave us a telling off at all. It was always Mom's job, as she was strict. Anyway, we were at the dinner table, and me and my siblings were all bickering, not sure about what. All of a sudden, my dad slams his fist on the table and shouts, "Shut up." We all put our heads down in shock, as we never experienced this before. One by one, we started to giggle. Even our mom started giggling. We looking over to my dad, who was looking down at his plate, and all we could see was his shoulders going up and down, and of course he just burst out laughing. I think he shocked himself that day, but no one could take it seriously.
It's funny how sometimes the calmest people surprise you. My friend's dad was exactly like that. Always quiet, rarely raised his voice. One day during dinner, after some sibling bickering, he suddenly yelled, "Shut up," with a slam on the table. We all froze. But then he couldn't help it and started laughing, his shoulders shaking. That little burst of anger turned into an unexpected moment of joy, a memory we'll all remember.
When I was in elementary school, I was being bullied at recess, and the teacher/monitor wasn't doing anything about it. My dad didn't work a traditional office job. He made his own schedule, which let him have a lot of flexibility. After getting to run around at the school, he was referred to some bureaucrat at the district offices. Well, this guy did not want to meet my father, so despite my dad making an appointment, he wasn't in that day. Fun fact, that excuse doesn't work very well when you have labeled dedicated parking spots. The appointment was at 2 p.m., so my dad blocked the car in, rolled down the windows, pulled out a book, and started reading. At around 7 p.m., he hears the cough of a man who wants to get someone's attention while not being obvious about it. Oh, look at that. The bureaucrat showed up to the office and is ready for his 2 p.m. appointment.
I can relate to that feeling of being overlooked. I remember in middle school, I had a tough time with some kids too. My parents weren't as proactive, but they always encouraged me to stand up for myself. When I finally did, it was like a weight lifted off. It's interesting how small actions can lead to bigger changes, like your dad sitting in that parking spot. Sometimes persistence pays off.
One of my school teachers was the most patient, kind man who would work with you until you got something, even if it meant he had to miss his lunch. There is this girl who was a mouthy little shit. She would mess around his class repeatedly. He always kept his cool, even when she was being incredibly rude. Discipline never worked on this kid. I don't know how she didn't get expelled. One day, she was drinking Coke in chemistry class, and he repeatedly told her stop because we were messing around with chemicals and there was a contamination risk, but she didn't listen. After months of this kid giving him shit, he slowly walked over to her desk, picked up her Coke, and poured it over her head, then walked back to the front of class and carried on teaching. He got fired, much to our protestations.
That teacher sounds like he really cared about his students. It's rough when someone who puts in so much effort gets pushed to the edge. That girl must have tested his patience more than anyone expected. Pouring Coke over her head was definitely not the way to handle it, but it showed how he finally snapped. Getting fired for that seems unfair, especially when he was always there for us.
There was this quiet, nerdy Asian guy I was friends with in high school who was super nice. One day someone caught him in a bad mood and was picking on him. My Asian friend walked by the guy as if he were leaving the room and then whipped around behind his tormentor and full-on suplexed the guy out of the room. Not just a toss. This was a back-arching WWE-style suplex, and I laughed until I cried.
That's pretty hilarious. It's wild how people can surprise you. You see someone who seems quiet and unassuming, then they pull off something like that. I'd imagine it changed the way people thought about him. Sometimes, when you least expect it, someone can show their true colors. It's cool to see someone stand up for themselves like that and get a good laugh out of it too.
My brother-in-law is a really soft-spoken guy that really kind of keeps to himself. That said, he's also huge and built like Bam Bam Bigelow for all you 80s wrestling fans out there. In addition, he's covered in tattoos, head, neck, everything. So you can imagine he's a pretty intimidating guy, which is why his soft voice and very chill demeanor can be really surprising. We're in a movie theater enjoying a flick when the kids behind us start acting up and throwing popcorn, talking, and generally making a ruckus. My BIL stands up, turns around, and asks them to quiet down since they're disturbing everyone else. They behave for 15 minutes or so, but then slowly start acting up again. He stands up without a word, grabs the lead instigator by the throat, lifts him out of his chair one-handed, pulls him in close and growls, "Shut the fuck up," and sits him back down gently. The rest of the movie was very peaceful.
It's funny how appearances can be so misleading. Your brother-in-law seems like this intimidating figure, but he's actually calm. The way he handled those kids shows he can be both firm and gentle. It really changes the whole vibe in the theater. It's cool when someone can assert themselves without resorting to shouting or drama. Sometimes, a simple presence is enough to bring order.
Not a man, but my twin brother when we were in 5th grade. I got picked on a lot when I was in middle school. My brother is one of those people who is very calm unless someone picks on me, then he'll snap. One day, we were in the locker bay when my brother overheard someone calling me a nerd. He then grabbed that kid by the shirt and said, "Nerd nerd," or "nerd candy." We were 11. The kid says, "Nerd nerd." Then my brother said, "Wrong answer," and slammed him as hard as he could into the lockers. Not many people picked on me after that.
That's a solid story. It's cool that your brother had your back like that. Siblings can really step up when someone crosses the line. That moment probably changed how people viewed you both. No one wants to mess with someone who has a protective twin. It's nice to know someone's got your back in tough times, especially in school. Just shows the bond you both have.
Story from my dad. When he was younger, probably around 17 or 18, he got in a car accident, which wasn't his fault. He happened to be in an accident with some hot-headed lawyer that threatened him physically and told him that my dad, would pay for it because he is a lawyer. My dad tells me that my grandfather was a very calm man that contained himself despite being able to put up a fight both physically and intellectually with most people. Well, my grandfather got word of this and went to the house where that lawyer lived. My grandfather fought in World War II, played semi-pro football, and boxed in Philadelphia. My dad does not know what happened, but they never heard from that lawyer again, and he got a new car. My grandfather took what he did that day to the grave. Sorry this story is so jumbled, I'm not as great writer, and it's all from memory of what my dad told me.
That's a wild story. Your grandfather sounds like a tough guy, handling things in his own way. It's interesting how the past shapes people. Your dad probably learned a lot from him about staying calm and dealing with trouble. The fact that he never found out what happened adds a bit of mystery to it too. Sometimes actions speak louder than words, and it seems like your granddad knew that well.
Back when we were 12 or 13 years old, a classmate/friend of mine was the Game Boy geek of our class. He was the guy whom you gave your Game Boy to, and he did the level or boss for you with ease. Also, he was playing Game Boy on the bus ride home each day. One day, a kid comes up to him and keeps turning off his Game Boy. He shows no reaction and calmly turns it back on like nothing happened and continues to play. The other kid keeps turning it off over and over again. So this goes back and forth for some time. When the other kid reaches for the 15th time to turn off the Game Boy, my friend, without taking his eyes from the screen calmly, intercepts his finger, breaks it, and continues to silently play his game.
That story makes me think of how focused some people can get on their games. It's like nothing else matters to them in that moment. I guess your friend really knew how to handle distractions. It's interesting how some kids will test the limits, while others just want to zone out and enjoy their game. I can't help but wonder what happened after that incident. Did the kid ever mess with him again?
When I was at school, about 13, there was a girl who was so stereotypical. She was quiet, always with her head in a book, and didn't really care about what was happening around her. One day, a guy started trying to fight me. He was some ass, the bully of the year. He pushed me to the ground and started kicking me. Without a word, this girl, who was also bullied by this guy, got up and punched him in the face, knocking him out cold. We're dating now.
That's a solid story. You never know who might surprise you. That girl really stepped up when it counted. It's cool how things change after school, and now you two are together. Just goes to show that quiet people can have hidden strengths. Some bonds form in the most unexpected ways.
So, one of my mates at school is always gentle and kind and never really reacts when shit happens to him. He's a pretty muscly dude, so, whenever we pass him during school, he usually gets his arms grabbed by one of the boys. Well, one day at lunch, someone grabbed his arm and then shoved a chip into his mouth. You wouldn't want to be the guy that did that because my mate grabbed a handful of chips in one hand, the guy by his shirt in the other, and then proceeded to drag the guy along one of the benches whilst punching him in the mouth with a handful of chips. Suffice to say, we learned that day not to take shit too far with my mate.
That's an interesting story. Shows how some people can only take so much. Your mate seems pretty cool, but there's a limit to being nice. I guess it was one of those moments where everyone learned a lesson. You laugh about it later, but in the moment, it was probably pretty tense. His way of handling it was unique, though. After that, I imagine people thought twice about messing with him.
Back in school, there was a kid who used to like to think of himself as a bit of a hard man. In reality, he was anything but, and liked to assert that authority by pushing around kids he didn't think would do anything about it. There wasn't always a pattern to it, like he didn't always go for the nerdy kids, literally just anybody that seemed like they'd let him get away with it. So one day he's physically pushing this guy around a bit, a pretty regular nice guy. No reason for him being singled out except that he was fairly quiet, jeering at him, making fun of him and grinning like it was the funniest thing in the world. That is, right up until the moment the kid spun around and planted a perfect punch right on his nose, splatting it nicely across his face. Down the would-be bully in one hit, turned back around, and carried on like nothing had happened. Nobody tried to pick on that kid again, and the loudmouth bully quieted down a lot after that.
It's funny how people show their true colors. There was this kid in my school who thought he was tough, always picking on quieter kids. He targeted one specific nice guy who never bothered anyone. One day, that guy snapped and landed a solid punch right on the bully's nose. It instantly changed the dynamic. The bully learned not to mess with others, and the nice guy got some respect. Just goes to show, looks can be deceiving.
In study hall in HS, I was sitting at a table with some friends. One of my friends sitting with us was from another group of friends and didn't really know the other guys sitting with us very well. He's a very nice and shy kid, but enormous. Like 6 feet 4 inches, 300 pounds enormous. Anyway, one of my other friends, tiny kid, maybe 130 pounds, tops, is messing with him and teasing him a bit. But the big guy is ignoring him and just doing his homework. But eventually the right button was pushed, I don't remember how, and without warning, the smaller, annoying kid is flying through the air into the wall. Pretty funny.
So, there we were in study hall, just hanging out. This huge guy was minding his own business, doing homework, while a smaller friend kept poking fun at him. Eventually, the big guy had enough. Out of nowhere, he just launched the little dude into the wall. Everyone froze for a second, then burst out laughing. It was one of those moments that just caught us all off guard. Good times.
My dad is probably the perfect example of this. We were on a Boy Scout trip, and the scoutmaster was notoriously weird and sexist. He made a disparaging remark about my mom, and my dad picked this guy up by his throat, threw him over a picnic table, then proceeded to lay 3 full body weight punches to the side of his head. He stood up completely calm and said, "Son, grab your things. People like this deserve no respect, and I won't have you associate with them." He's a good dude.
That's a strong memory. Sounds like your dad really stood up for what he believes in. It's not every day you see that kind of reaction. He made a point that goes beyond just standing up for your mom. It's about respect. Moments like that can stick with you, showing the importance of integrity. It's good to have someone in your corner like that.
My father is a quiet man. I have seen him shout once. I was 10, me and my dad were sitting in the cinema watching The Phantom Menace. It was just released. Popcorn hits me in the head, and I hear giggles. I turn around and see maybe 7 or 8 teenage kids laughing. I'm 10. I'm scared. I don't say anything. More minutes of film, more popcorn hitting me. Eventually, my dad notices and turns round, politely asks them to stop. A few minutes of peace, then a whole handful of kernels shower me and my dad. He stands up, turns round and screams, "Can you read?" One kid say yeah, sarcastically. Dad pulls his wallet out and opens it, showing his work badge, and shouts, "What does that say?" Kid leans forward to read, then mumbles, "West Midlands Police." Dad shouts up now. Kid stands up, the other are deathly quiet. Dad frog matches kid down steps of cinema to foyer. I stay in my seat and watch film. When Dad returns on his own, I ask him what happened. He said, "I told the manager I didn't pay 20 quid to have some throw popcorn at me."
That definitely sounds like a memorable moment. Your dad seems like a protective figure, stepping up when things got out of hand. It's interesting how even quiet people can have a breaking point. It must have felt surreal sitting there, watching the whole thing unfold. I wonder if the kids learned a lesson that day. Honestly, seeing your dad in that situation must have made an impression on you, in a way that's hard to forget.
My second-year electronics teacher in high school was one of the nicest, patient men I have ever met. He restores model as in his spare time. He had to go to the office for something, and a couple kids thought it would be funny to hook together line cords, put them into power strips, and turn them on, and watch them arc and burn the table. Teacher came back and lost his shit, screaming at them and told them to stay after class. Only time I ever saw him raise his voice.
Sounds like that teacher had a real passion for what he did. It's interesting how a calm person can suddenly change when pushed. The kids probably didn't think it would escalate like that. It's a reminder that even the nicest people have their limits. I hope those kids learned something from that moment, though. You don't mess around with electricity.
I didn't see it, but was told about it by my dad, who is said patient/gentleman. Normally never gets that annoyed by anything, and September 10th lets my mom deal with most things. However, one day, in the office, some series of events happened which made him snap, and he stood up, picked up his chair, and rammed it through the ceiling. He then walked off, and it was left hanging there, jammed in the ceiling while the rest of the office stared in stunned silence. Fortunately, he is now happily retired.
That's a wild story about your dad. It's interesting to hear about someone usually calm having a breaking point. I can imagine the shock in the office when that chair was stuck up there. It's good he found a way to relax after that, though. Retirement can do wonders for people, I guess.
This happened to my dad. He was at a family wedding reception in the 1950s. Two rough guys who were on motorcycles crashed the party. They were drinking at the bar and using bad language. One of the women asked the bride's father, Howard, who was in his 60s, to intervene. Howard was a former professional wrestler. Howard approached the man and said, "You boys will have to leave." The man said, "Fuck you." My dad said that Howard put this guy in an arm lock so fast, you wouldn't believe it. Howard said, "You're leaving now, or I'm breaking your goddamn arm off." The men sheepishly left. Howard had a son, Mike, who was also a professional wrestler. Mike was not so nice. He was in the other room at the time, but had he known, he would have killed the guy.
That's a solid story. It's interesting how things can escalate at events like weddings. Howard seems like the type who wouldn't take any nonsense. I can imagine the tension when those guys showed up. The arm lock must have shocked everyone there. Funny to think about Mike in the other room, probably ready to step in if things got messy. It's good that it didn't come to that.
My dad was an amazing man, and he was always friendly to everyone except for people who would talk about his family. In high school, he played football, American obviously. Once, while he was in high school, well, Maybe a few more times, some idiot joked about his mom, which is never a good thing to do unless you know the person. He picked him up by the collar and slammed him against the wall in a hallway. A few teachers and the principal ran to him and all had to combine their powers like the fucking Power Rangers and finally got him to let go.
It's interesting how a simple joke can push someone to a breaking point. Your dad clearly had a strong sense of loyalty and protection for his family. It's a bit wild to think about how many people had to intervene to calm him down. Shows the strength of his character, even if it got out of hand. It's a reminder that family is a touchy subject for some.
It's funny, I think about this quite a lot. In real life, I am very calm and generally have a lot of patience with people. But when I snap, I snap. I'm not sure it's a good way to be, because most people, even the super dramatic ones, give out strong signals that they're getting annoyed. I think mine are too subtle, so they tend to be quite surprised when I get pissed off. It's like 0 to 100 in a second. I need to get better at signaling my annoyance.
I can relate to that. It's usually the calm ones who catch people off guard when they finally lose it. Sometimes, you think you're being clear, but others just miss the signs. It's that inner buildup that surprises everyone around you. It's probably worth working on those signals so you don't have to go from 0 to 100. Just a little heads up might save some confusion later on.
My friend had broke his hip running, lame, I know, and was put in a wheelchair. He usually took things in stride and didn't mind idiots, but one day in gym while in his wheelchair, a freshman had ran up and started pushing him around against his will. We heard him saying, "Stop," and such, try not to get mad. The kid nearly flips over our friend, and he visibly changed. He hit the brake, stopping the wheelchair in its track. The kid stood there like he was going to release the brake and get to push my friend again. My friend stands up from the wheelchair and spins around and grabs the kid by his collar and lifts him from the ground and just stares at him. After about 5 seconds, he just let the kid go and the kid ran off crying. He hobbled back to his wheelchair and wheeled over to us and began having a merry time joking about how scared shitless the kid was.
Honestly, that sounds pretty wild. Your friend kept cool until that kid pushed his buttons too far. It's crazy how people don't think before they act, especially with someone in a wheelchair. But I guess your friend showed him he's not to be messed with. Turning the tables like that must have been satisfying for him. At least he could laugh about it afterward. Not everyone would handle it so well.
This happened in the mid-90s. My dad was taking a cassette out of the VCR and it got stuck inside. This particular VCR had a history of eating tapes. My dad is the most patient and calm guy I've ever met. And normally he would have taken the time to carefully extricate the tape, even if it took him 10 minutes. This day, however, upon realizing the tape was stuck inside, he banged on the top of the VCR a couple of times. Didn't help. Then he picked the VCR up, yanked it off the shelf, unplugging it from the wall, and then crossed the room to the window. He opened the window, took the time to remove the screen, and proceeded to throw the VCR out the window, where it fell 2 stories to the driveway below. This wasn't satisfying enough. He put the screen back in a window, grabbed his keys, walked down the block to get his truck, drove it back to the house, and ran over the VCR multiple times. It was thoroughly destroyed. Nothing like it has ever happened again.
I can imagine that scene. Your dad sounds like he snapped after all those tape-eating incidents. It's like he just reached a breaking point. Most would try to fix things or keep calm, but he took it to another level. I mean, throwing a VCR out the window and running it over is something you don't see every day. Must have felt good to let off that steam, though.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.